Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope that you are doing well and that you've had a good first half week, I guess, and that you're feeling energetic and prepared to get into it because today is the first substantive unit in the course. And we're going to begin very, very broadly. We're going to talk about political institutions and what they are, how they work, what they do, who made them. And in particular, we'll talk about some institutional choices available to institutional designers of democratic regimes. This is kind of the first layer before we begin to discuss democracy and its institutions next week. So before we even conceptualize democracy, we'll conceptualize institutions and what they do and what they are and why they become important to democracy. So thank you very much for being with us today. Very happy to see you. People are still trickling in. As a reminder, we are recording this, and so you can review it later and access it later. Of course, some of us aren't able to attend, and so that becomes important for them too. But those of you who are here, very happy to have you. Let me get set up and we'll be off to the races. So if you've ever been to Buenos Aires, you've ever been to the Federal District, you couldn't have missed the Casa Rosada. It's this beautiful pink, I think it's supposed to be red, but it obviously looks pink. This beautiful pink red building that houses the presidential palace and the office. It's this classical building that's obviously inspired by sort of like European classical architecture. And you can't miss it. It's right in the middle of the Federal District. You get off the subway, the metro, and it's right there. And you sort of turn each way and you see all these big, imposing buildings, these large classical or concrete buildings that just seem so imposing and so authoritative and so historied and old and just kind of established, right? You just get this overwhelming sense that you're in the presence of great power, really. That's what it feels like. And if you go down the road a ways, you'll find yourself in front of this building, which is the Edificio Libertador, which is the building that houses the Argentine Ministry of Defense. Now, it looks a little shabby, as you can see, and it is a little shabby, but it's also an authoritative structure. And it's a building that just absolutely just kind of gives off this powerful air. And it's this feeling that you get when you're around it that it's unmistakable. It has the feel of an institution. It is, after all, an institution. And institutions, first and foremost, at least the formal ones, are often, at the end of the day, just buildings. Now, they house people who have formal power that's been vested in them by some system or some document. And those people and those organizations use those powers to make decisions that affect everyone. But after all, at the end of the day, they're really just people in buildings, just like we are. That's what institutions are. They are structures that we create. They are sources of power that we create that are then put to use in society to make decisions and to move resources. And we have to live under those decisions made inside those walls by those power brokers who hold the power vested in those institutions. So institutions, in the first place, are humanly devised constraints. They are things that we create. We build those buildings. We create the power vested in those institutions. The president of Argentina has the power that they have because a constitutional order was devised that gave them that power. That Casa Rosada is a symbol of presidential power in Argentina because it was decided and it was sanctioned long ago to vest presidential power in the occupant of that house. The Ministry of Defense in Argentina was substantially empowered in 1983. That power that was created and given to that Ministry of Defense, that is a human artifact. It is a product of decisions made by people in society who used power that preceded that power, and so on and so forth. But as you can already see, institutions are a difficult concept. They seem very obscure, they seem very omnipresent, they seem mysterious and elusive, but they also seem monolithic and authoritative. They are all of these things. They are all of these things and much, much more. And the most important point, though, is that we are the ones who create them. They are products of our creation. And in turn, there are some key questions that we have to address when we talk about products of our creation. What are we creating? What do they do? Why do we have them? And really, who made them? Which humans made them? And why did they make them? What was the context or the circumstances of their creation? In the broadest sense, institutions are sets of rules. They are norms and practices that organize and constitute social relations. What we say is that institutions structure behavior. They are those physical features of the environment, those humanly devised constraints that constitute and structure social relationships in any given domain of human life, be it economic or political or social. These institutions always emerge from society, and they structure social, political, and economic interactions in turn. I cannot stress this enough. Institutions are distinct from structures because structures simply are the forms or the outlines that larger things might take. So when you say the structure of the economy, no one deliberately created that structure. It's the result of a number of individual decisions. Institutions, on the other hand, are deliberately created. They are created, they are constructed and devised for specific purposes. And that purpose is always to structure social and political and economic interactions. And more specifically, and what the economists would tell you, is that they are designed to facilitate collective action or cooperation and to reduce transaction costs or the costs of doing business that accrue to participants in transactions or in activities in those domains of human life. Institutions then have a very important role to play. And in the very first place, we create them and they become aspects of the environment that structure and constitute our social relations. And so at this stage, you should be asking, well, can you give us some examples? Because this is very abstract, and it is abstract. This is what makes institutions difficult as a concept. They are abstract, and they can be better understood if we think in terms of some really recognizable ones that we deal with every day and that we might not ever think about as conventions or humanly devised constraints, things that we've created. Do you have money? Well, that's an institution. Do you engage in exchange? Do you make purchases? That is an institution. Do you interact with the government, or do you interact with services or institutions of the government or the state, either to obtain a driver's license or to pay your taxes? Those are institutions. Markets in general, where you might obtain food or whatever it is that you need to buy, those are institutions. Governments participate in markets. They also largely create them and constitute them. But governments themselves are institutions as well. And we created, ultimately, the concept and the notion of a government or a state. All of these things are examples of institutions. And what I want to impress upon you is that social life and political life, as you'll see, is really not imaginable outside of the scope and the perspective of these institutions. These creations make social life and human life in society possible because they reduce those costs and they facilitate that cooperation on a large scale that helps us to function as a society. So these are very abstract examples, granted, but here in a moment, we'll take a look at some more concrete ones where we take a look at actual examples of democratic and authoritarian political institutions, which we'll deal with when we begin to drill down into some of the specifics of political institutions. Just a minute, everyone. I need to share again because for some reason my Zoom is sort of coming and going. Yeah, so Christopher adds in the chat, because they come and go as society changes. This is true. This is true. They do come and they go as society changes. But I want to also suggest that they might be more unchangeable than you think. Institutions are not easily created in the first place. They're not easily destroyed, and they're not easily changed either. The reason is because once we create them, they tend to persist and they become valued for their own sake. They become part of social life, and we organize our behavior around it. We don't change the institutions to align with changes in our behavior. More likely, more often than not, our behavior changes the more often than not, our behavior we change to align with the conventions or the norms or the rules or the humanly devised constraints that we're talking about. So they can change as society changes, but that's always a difficult process. And the reason it's important for us to understand how these institutions become so inertial is because a democracy relies on the stability of these democratic institutions. Democratic institutions have a very important role to play in stabilizing politics, in facilitating the peaceful transfer of power, in facilitating the acceptance of the election outcome by the different participants in the race, in delivering responsive government and creating public policies that represent and account for the views of citizens, and so on and so forth. These institutions need to be stable. And so in democracy and elsewhere, as we'll see, institutions tend to persist and become valued for their own sake, even if there might be more efficient alternatives. For example, how many of you have ever wondered, why are we stuck with the Electoral College? It completely underweights California, and it disproportionately empowers small red states. And winning elections for one particular party usually requires really outpunching the other party, disproportionately so. That's an institution, and it's a system that was set up for specific reasons and often to promote specific interests. These institutions are not easily changed, even when they're very inefficient, and we can plainly see how they deviate from what we might consider a democratic ideal. They tend to persist. And it's because the institution empowers and benefits certain actors who then develop a vested interest and will defend those institutions. And because it also weakens those who have to bear the costs of the institutions. And so the institutions are hard to change, and they're difficult to change, and they're difficult to create. But on this point of the way in which they become valued for their own sake, how many of you give gifts on holidays or for birthdays? Do you receive gifts? Do you ever stop and think about that convention? That's not necessarily an automatic or a natural behavior. We could just as easily replace gift giving with something else, right? But for whatever reason, we have an institution of gift giving, and there is a gift economy. And this set of conventions and norms around gift giving structure our behavior. How often do you feel compelled to give a gift, even if you don't want to, right? And I won't make you admit it because you don't want to out yourself, but I'm sure that all of us, there's been a time where you just don't want to give a gift, but you feel compelled to because there's sort of an unspoken rule or a norm around that, and your behavior is then shaped by that convention. That's an example of an institution in the way in which it shapes our behavior and the way in which it is valued for its own sake. Christopher follows up. You cannot say that better. Our Constitution is outdated and needs to be revised to update and make government institutions more functional for all citizens. Agreed, right? Why should the vote of a Nebraskan count for more than a vote of a Californian? All the votes should count the same, right? And this is an example of how institutions can be outstripped by political and economic and social changes on the ground. The constitutional order in the United States is the oldest constitutional order in the world. These democratic institutions have been with us for more than 200 years. And so naturally, circumstances on the ground have begun to change. And sure enough, it's been difficult to even imagine changing the institutions, despite that the circumstances have sort of evolved, beyond the original expectation of the framers. Karen says, gift giving is annoying, but I always feel pressured to do it. Yeah, exactly. Same here. Sometimes in the past, I've tried to give people gifts on my birthday, which, it's difficult to sustain that, right? But, you still feel compelled to do something, engage in this social behavior, this act, participate, not participate really, but conform. It's really a matter of conforming or adhering to the rules. We don't think of it as a relation of participation, but one of compliance or authority or even subordination. That's the nature of a rule-based relationship. Efren says, can you elaborate what the gift economy means? Yeah, so just the general, the set of social conventions around giving gifts. There's sort of this understanding or this implicit understanding that you give gifts on a birthday or maybe holidays that are meaningful. Maybe that you receive gifts as well on those birthdays that are your own. And this is what I mean by the gift economy, right? Consumerism is also an institution. It is. It is. Consumption is a set of practices or a behavior, right? There are a lot of critical theorists of neoliberal globalization who argue that an institutional or a culture of consumption and consumerism is necessary to sustain globalization and capitalism. And that set of behaviors can be thought of as social conventions. And the foundations or the roots, the institutional foundations or the conventions or the norms that create the basis for a system. Hector says, Japan has a big gift-giving culture. Some young Japanese citizens find this culture very hard to keep up with. Yeah, absolutely. And I've heard this too, and have received gifts from some of my own Japanese friends. And I've felt sometimes that I've wondered if I didn't give enough gifts and if maybe I wasn't sort of keeping up with that enough, because sometimes you feel self-conscious if someone gives you a gift and you don't have one for them, right? This sort of thing. Kiana says, are institutions similar to states? So the state, the abstract concept of the state, the human organization that establishes a monopoly of violence within a given territory, that is an institution in the sense that the state structures our behavior. The rules, the policies of the state that we live under, they create sets of behaviors that are acceptable, and they create sets that are unacceptable, and they punish us if we don't follow them. So the state is an institution. But if you were to say, is Japan an example of an institution? Well, Japan is a country. It has a legal personality in the sense that it's a state. But the institution would be the concept or the notion of the state, the human organization that establishes the monopoly of violence within a territory. Christopher says, I was reading that it could be a traditional social norm or value that created that institution, like gift giving be certain rule days. Oh yeah, and I think that there are very obvious and very good reasons that gift giving evolved as an institution. I think that it goes back to, obviously earlier times when groups would establish relationships with each other and try to establish alliances and cement alliances for political reasons. And that was obviously helped along by gift giving. And so I think that there's a good reason that we give gifts. but it's also an example of the way in which an institution can sort of outlive itself, so to speak. It's not always clear to us why we give gifts. If the original reason of gift giving was, well, establish alliances between groups so that you can, concentrate power and better survive and protect yourself in a lawless world, well, that world is no longer the world we live in. And so this is an example of how institutions tend to endure over the long term. Jeffrey says state and government are different. The government submits to the laws of the state. Absolutely. So when we say the government, sometimes we also mean that as the state. But if we say the government of Joe Biden, we mean the Joe Biden administration, and that Joe Biden administration is subject to the rules laid down by the Constitution, which governs the state, right? So governments, individual governments, are bound by the rules of the state, and so the state is above the government in that abstract sense. But the abstract concept of both the state and the government, those are examples of institutions. So as you can see, everyone, this is a relatively abstract discussion where it's not always clear what an example might be. But this is why here in a moment, we'll take a look at some footage that puts this in perspective for us. And in particular, by showing the transition from dictatorship to democracy and then from democracy to dictatorship again in Egypt. But before we get there, we have to say what we mean by political institutions, because these are, after all, the ones that we are referring to when we say the institutions of democracy. So if institutions are the rules of the game that organize society, political institutions are the institutions that regulate the limits of political power and determine how political power changes hands. So it's all about power and how the power vested in institutions and bodies is sort of structured or distributed or mediated or regulated by a set of rules or a framework that we create for the purpose of doing so. And so in a more specific and a more concrete sense, what we mean is the type of regime, the types of constraints on political elites, the extent to which powers are separated. And in practice, that means, is the regime democratic? Is it a dictatorship? Is the system parliamentary or is it presidential? Is the party system a multi-party system, or is it a two-party system, or a one-party system, or a no-party system, and so on and so forth? We can identify a whole number of other different institutional dimensions of social life that are political, but these are some of the most important ones. And what these have in common is that they shape the incentives of the elites who have to abide by them, and they shape the distribution of political power. And so the rules regarding executive legislative relationships will determine, among other things, who can introduce new legislation. What are the circumstances or the rules for voting on that legislation? Does the president have the power to veto specific items in a bill, or do they have to veto the whole bill? All sorts of questions about the way in which the different actors in the system share the power or have power between them in that system. What are the powers of the Senate majority leader? What are the powers of the House majority leader? And so on and so forth. What are the powers of the parliamentary majority? What are the circumstances or rules about a vote of no confidence in a parliamentary system? Does the parliament also have to decide on a new prime minister, or are immediate snap elections held? I could give you an infinite number of examples of different ways that institutional frameworks distribute power and the way they distribute responsibility in systems. The elites face different incentives based upon the institutional differences. The elites face different distributions of power based upon those institutional differences. These differences become very, very important because it's those differences that we connect to some of the key outcomes of interest when we study institutions. And so before I give you some examples, and before we go into something more concrete, let me take a look at the chat. No, as Christopher points out, in the United States, the president does not have a line item veto. They have to veto the full bill. But in Latin America, most presidents have a line item veto. They can veto specific portions of a bill that gives them substantial power. You might also argue, however, that it gives the legislature power, depending upon your interpretation. But as you can see, the technical details of the distribution of power and responsibility can become very, very tedious and very detailed. This becomes Byzantine in its sophistication. This is the nature of political institutions, and it's why they're actually so difficult to study, because what we mean by the institution is more often a bundle of institutions or a set of rules, right? The characteristics of the Senate, not the Senate. The characteristics of the electoral system, not the electoral system itself. Michael says, would an example be that Lincoln wasn't satisfied with just the Emancipation Proclamation, but also needed the passing of the 13th Amendment? So, Michael, I'm going to tell you that I don't know enough about the precise details to say, I think that you're pretty much correct. He wasn't satisfied and demanded additional legislation. But I have to say, I don't know the details well enough to speak authoritatively on that. But yeah, that is more or less an example of how presidents can use their power vis-a-vis the legislature to bring about an outcome, right? And how the distribution of power can influence what presidents ultimately get. So if a president is able to say, well, I don't like what you've done, and I won't actually approve it, in this case, the Emancipation Proclamation, without also the passing of the 13th Amendment, that's clearly an example of the sort of threat of the use of veto power over a full bill. So one of the most visible distinctions or sets of political institutions, or choices, if you will, is the choice between democracy and dictatorship, or forms of government. And obviously in this class, we talk about democracy. But clearly, we choose democracy as one among multiple alternatives, and dictatorship is one of those alternatives. And these differences are quite striking and quite important. And when we talk about the incentives created by institutions and the way that they distribute power, what we mean is this: under a democracy, leaders have an incentive to try to win as many votes as possible. They have an incentive to try to satisfy as many voters as possible, to please them, to satiate them, to quench them, to satisfy them, right? And to handle them with care, at least theoretically. I know that in practice it deviates from that, but humor me here. Theoretically, that's what a democracy incentivizes. Under a dictatorship, by contrast, leaders have a very, very different set of incentives. Their survival depends on satisfying a set of narrow elites, including the military or business or foreign interests. And more importantly, it also depends on killing off their opponents. It does. It does. So the institutional difference between democracy and dictatorship becomes quite striking when we consider the incentives generated by the two theoretical pure types, right? The sort of theoretical democracy versus the theoretical dictatorship. These are very important differences. They mean then that political leaders should behave differently if they're rational, if they want to survive in office and keep power, and if they want to gain power. They should behave very differently based upon whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. And so I want to give you an example that shows in real time the kind of fluctuation between dictatorship and democracy and back to dictatorship. And that is the example of Egypt, where during the Arab Spring, they successfully overthrew the dictatorship and held democratic elections, only to only briefly have a democracy and then revert back to dictatorship in specifically sort of military authoritarian or a ruling presidential rule under General al-Sisi. And I want you to focus on the change in the institutional framework, in the way that the rules of the game change from dictatorship to democracy, from democracy to dictatorship. And also pay attention to the incentives and the different motivations of leaders under the two types of institutions. And so let's take a look at this video.
It's been 5 years, but it's kind of hard not to remember the 18 days. I guess it was a time of great opportunity and potential. People in this population that suddenly, after all of those years of being sidelined, suddenly were in the mix. And that gave people a sense that they had a chance to actually build their own future. So I guess it was probably the best year I've had in my life. I'm very grateful for it.
Remember the 18 days by hope. We were young at the time and we were ambitious that we can have democracy in the Middle East, we have democracy in Egypt, we can take down the regime. It was amazing. It's like a great sense of belonging to this country.
When you take a look back, the real problem on January 25th, 2011 was the sense that the government basically took us for granted. On February 12th, the day after Mubarak stepped down, we had a different slew of problems. We had won. We didn't think we would win, which is why nobody actually thought what would happen afterwards.
I think our mistake was leaving on the 11th of February after he stepped down because we should have stayed for a constitution first and fought for a proper roadmap. It was us, you know, it was the marginalized that came out for social justice and for human dignity, I guess. You know, a lot of sacrifice was made, a lot of blood was shed. I was burying kids half my age, you know, and that is a big sacrifice. We didn't care if we will die or live, but we wanted to live well and with dignity if that happened. So I think it was the disappointment later on that such a hefty price, and at the end we were not the ones, you know, to harvest this.
The people, when it came to Sisi, they viewed him as the person who's going to save the country. And now he's not as popular anymore because people are slowly realizing that there is no vision and no leadership or anything of that sort. And it has been a slow realization. But now it's scary how unpopular he is.
In the moment we were in shock. We're young people, so we only practiced free politics after the revolution. And after the revolution, we had free public opinion. But in the moment, this is a new reality. We're not able to demonstrate in the streets because we will be hunted down. The situation under Mubarak was like heaven in comparison with the current situation. They were so bloody. We couldn't even imagine that they are that bloody, and many people got killed. And then we had crackdown on civil society, political parties, newspapers. Political activists are being jailed. They're closing even the theaters, the art centers. They're blocking many articles. They're blocking many websites. So we have full crackdown on the Egyptian revolution.
If you take away from the youth their freedom, and you take away from them their ambition and potential, I don't think there's much left for them. So you're dealing with a situation where there was such high patriotism and nationalism and energy 5 years ago, and now there is a sense of we just want to get out of here, we just want a visa, we just want to immigrate somewhere else and start over in a country that works.
life for the youth now is very traumatic. Imagine you've been burying your friends at university, you've been called the enemy of the state, terrorists. Anyone who opposes now is being called a terrorist. It's breeding violence and frustration and depression.
The politicized youth who are leaving, they are the finest of their generation, and they will not add anything to their own country because they feel that they are nothing in Egypt. And the others, they are in jail. They lose themselves forever. I met one of them when he came out of the prison. He's not the same person. He has been under continuous torture, and he hates the country. He hates the regime. He hates everyone. I have people who lost their lives for the revolution. I'm proud of what they did, but I feel ashamed of myself and my colleagues because we couldn't even achieve what they died for.
I don't think that our president is gonna enjoy an illustrious long career such as his predecessor. I think we're gonna see the complete and utter disintegration of the state within the next 2 years.
I feel that we will have a moment when we must go back to the field, when we go back to the high square or any square. It's not about the high square only. And we fight for democracy and what we called for at the 18 days.
Oh yeah. Was it worth it? Question I ask myself all the time. I don't know. To have that year of possibilities, to live that little break between the dreary days of Mubarak and the more dreary days that came afterwards, I don't know. It was worth it. I don't think that Jan 25 happened because people wanted it to happen. I think Jan 25 happened because it had to happen. And I think everything that has happened afterwards is because it actually succeeded. Weirdly enough. What's happening right now, the way that the state is working and the way it's disintegrating and the way it's being exposed to the population, the way all of our problems are stayed there. Yeah, no. I think we got everything we ever wanted in the worst possible way.
So the reason I shared the Egyptian case is because it shows in such vivid ways how different authoritarian and democratic institutions are, in particular in terms of the incentives that they create. Under a dictatorship, you have to satisfy a narrow set of elites to stay in power, and you've got to effectively repress or kill off your opposition. Even if you don't want to, it becomes very difficult to survive in power if you don't do that, because someone more ruthless than you can easily upstage you, during the night in another coup and establish a more vicious and more authoritarian dictatorship. In a democracy, by contrast, which was in place for a very brief time in Egypt, people vote in elections that are free and fair and competitive, more or less, and they make collective decisions about who will rule. Of course, in Egypt, the rule of that democratically elected president became increasingly authoritarian, and that's a separate issue. But the transition from dictatorship to democracy, and then from democracy to dictatorship, was very jarring and striking because of the changing fortunes of citizens and people who have to live under the political institutions in Egypt. Let me take a look at the chat here because I have a feeling that some of you may have commented. Some comic relief. Is this how Trump supporters felt about America and Biden? We did just make some international history. Well, I think the cases are obviously very different. The disappointment that the pro-democratic reformers in Egypt felt when there was a reversal to dictatorship, I suppose the disappointment was somewhat similar to the disappointment that maybe the supporters of the former administration felt. I think any time an incumbent government can't stay in power or is defeated, and in this case in Egypt, when democracy is on the line, I think that there is some disappointment, certainly. Now, political institutions can be formal, and the ones that we've discussed so far are formal. Elections, the competitiveness of elections and the distribution of power, and the existence or absence of the separation of powers. We've kind of broadly differentiated between democracy and authoritarianism based on some of these characteristics. These are formal institutions in that they're sort of real and inscribed and written down and real. Informal ones, however, can be uncodified and can relate to how formal institutions are actually used in, in practice. So in the first place, those formal institutions are codified, they're written down in the Constitution. They are sanctioned in real in the sense that there's at least some reference for them, right? There's a codified de jure basis for their existence. In the legislature, judiciary, or political parties, the Constitution, the labor and employer organizations involved in a country, economic and financial institutions like the central bank, all of these are examples of formal institutions, and they are codified. But the informal institutions are also an important layer. And as I said, these relate to how those formal institutions are used in practice, how power is distributed in practice, and in what actually constitutes social norms. What the law says can be very different than what actually constitutes social norms. So, for instance, in India, the caste system has been effectively terminated for a long time. But many will tell you that the sort of legacies of the caste system persist, and that some of those class and group divisions are still with us today, and that they still remain relevant in a variety of ways. And so, what constitutes social norms can be informal, and often, if not necessarily, is compared to those formal and codified rules that are on paper and are written down. And so these rules of conduct within a given community or culture are the best example of informal institutions, and the specific ways that formal institutions are used in practice. So let me give you an example of the difference between formal and informal institutions and how this can be illuminated by looking at otherwise similar cases. We're going to look at the United States and Latin American countries. Their constitutions are very, very similar. They are presidential systems with similar setups, check and balance institutions. The presidents in those countries are often more powerful, but generally speaking, they are very, very similar in terms of the setup of the system. But, and there's a big but, the practice, the informal practice of politics in the limits on presidential power and elites in the US are very, very different than those in Latin America. So, what do I mean? Well, presidents are often more powerful in practice than they are in the United States. In Latin America, presidents are often very decisive, aggressive, very powerful. In fact, many Latin American democracies over time have been referred to as delegative democracies, and as democracies where presidents rule without parties. Now, what explains this informal aspect of Latin America and why it's different than the US? Well, there are a lot of factors. One of them is that in most cases, political parties and legislatures are less well established, and political parties are often more fragmented. And the party systems in Latin America have many, many parties, and the individual parties are often weaker. And because of that, it's more difficult to form legislative coalitions in blocks that can effectively mobilize and harness the power of the legislature to challenge the executive, where power is obviously concentrated in the hands of a president who represents a single party. And so that fragmented party system means that legislatures are often playing second fiddle to presidents. Whereas in the United States, a great deal of party system consolidation means that Congress and presidents are at a much more even sort of level in terms of their informal relationship beyond the actual formal powers given to them by the Constitution. And so The point here is that formal rules are only half of the story. The setup of the system is only what's written down on paper. How the system actually works in practice can be very different than how it's written down. Anyone who's become a new member of an organization or something has learned this. The unwritten rules are often more important than the written ones. Sometimes the written ones are not even enforced. The unwritten ones are the ones that are the most important. So let's watch a video that puts this in vivid perspective by talking about the case of Venezuela, where, well, they don't have a democracy in Venezuela anymore, especially since the cancellation of the referendum by the executive in 2017 and the attempted seizure of the legislature's power by the Supreme Court, which was stacked by the executive. But the story of Venezuela cannot be understood without understanding the informal power relations that have characterized that system more or less since the 2000s. And we're going to pick up in 2014, where President Maduro is handed sweeping powers as a sort of part of this evolving story of the sort of informal and executive centered politics in Venezuela.
President Nicolas Maduro is now one of the most powerful leaders in Latin America. The Enabling Act was passed by Parliament, allowing Hugo Chávez's successor to pass stringent new laws without consulting Congress. He's promised to wage a war on corruption, and private business owners, he believes, are bent on destroying Venezuela's ailing economy. In Bolivar Square, his supporters were jubilant.
It's a war between the elites and the poor. They have forced us to kneel down. They did whatever they wanted until President Chavez came. And now President Maduro continues to liberate us.
We are very proud of Maduro. He's the man, and he was the best gift that Chavez left us, because Maduro is his son, and he's doing everything that we have been expecting.
President Maduro has already jailed 100 shopkeepers for charging too much. Now he can force them to reduce their prices and take control of businesses viewed as corrupt. But opposition leaders say this latest move is a blatant power grab, and they now fear he'll use the act to silence critics.
So at the end, democracy loses, because democracy loses spaces for open discussion. Democracy loses spaces for citizen participation.
This is President Maduro's boldest move since he came to power in April, and it's proving popular amongst Venezuela's poor. But the 50-year-old former bus driver still faces challenging times ahead.
Even with his sweeping new powers, Nicolas Maduro will have to deal with an economy in freefall. Inflation is soaring. There's still a chronic shortage of basic goods on the shelves here, and a seemingly unstoppable black market in US dollars. But ultimately, Venezuelans will get to decide whether this latest bold move is right for their country or not when they vote in municipal elections in 3 weeks' time.
So what I want to suggest to you is that this extension of new presidential powers, that's not conceivable in the United States. The extension of the office of the president is more often carried out by the president, him or herself, here in the United States. It's less frequent that Congress or the legislature extends those new powers. But in Venezuela and in Latin America, where informally institutions are much more focused on executive power and where informally presidents have more power than their counterparts in the United States, this is more understandable. And so this is what I want to show you to illustrate that difference between the United States and Latin American countries in terms of their informal institutions. Now, before we go, let me address a few comments in the chat. Christopher says, is it really more level if the point of both parties is to own both houses of legislature and the executive? Well, that's the point of parties everywhere. In all presidential systems, the goal of the party is always to capture all houses of government. But assuming that different parties or different coalitions control different institutions, well, I think in that circumstance, it does become relevant whether informally the president is more powerful than the Congress. But I understand your point, Christopher. Efren says, would Mexico be an example from dictatorship to democracy due to the decline of the PRI in the 40s? Mexico transitioned in 2000, and the PRI began to decline as a hegemonic party in the 1990s, well, 80s really, then in the 90s, in response to crises, the earthquake, and increased competition. Christopher says, I have read PRI as simple changed its institutional rules and norms to fit more societal norms, but still have elite power players. Well, yeah, they do. And the PRI still uses patron-client relationships to purchase the votes of poor people and peasants in particular. Oscar says, Mexico was under a dictatorship with Porfirio Diaz era, but became democratic, creating the PRI, which there was not much change. Yeah, so Porfirio Diaz stayed in power for 30 years and the Mexican Revolution was waged to throw him out. And they established a constitutional order that was supposed to give rise to a democracy, but the PRI consolidated power under themselves and stayed in power for most of the 20th century. Uriel says, Efren, I don't think the PRI party rule was necessarily a dictatorship, but they definitely did have too much power for a very long time. It's interesting, Uriel. It's referred alternatively as a competitive authoritarian regime, where it's sort of like a hybrid regime, a mix between democracy and authoritarianism. And it's also been called an authoritarian regime because it was single party rule. And by some standards, some metrics, that disqualifies it from being democratic. But it certainly was relatively competitive, at least in terms of the elections. It's just that I think that it certainly wasn't democratic. But yeah, you're correct. There's sort of like some nuance, and there's room for disagreement there. Finally, Jeffrey says, one of my favorite examples is Germany. They went from being an autocracy to democracy to autocracy and back to democracy. And my favorite quote is from Benjamin Franklin when talking about democracy. It's a republic if you keep it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the point of that quote, and to kind of tie this all together, is to show that the institutions can be changed. And of all institutions, the ones that are changed maybe the most are political institutions, and democratic and authoritarian ones, because there's a lot at stake, and a lot of power can be had by those who are able to consolidate power. So thank you very much, everybody. That does conclude today's lecture. We'll finish the rest of this up on Monday. I'll post the rest of those readings, and I'll have office hours today as well, but I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope you have a nice weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Have a great weekend, Professor.
Thank you.